Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My car is my lifeline since I need it to meet clients and run errands. I park it on the street in front of my house, making sure it's not blocking anyone's driveway or causing problems. My neighbor across the street is one of those weekend warrior types. The guy owns at least 10 different baseball caps and they all have camouflage on them. He drives this massive Jeep that he's modified with all sorts of outdoor gear. The most noticeable thing about his Jeep is this huge cable winch mounted on the front grille that he uses for pulling stumps and hauling things when he goes hunting or fishing. The thing sticks out almost 1.5 feet in front of his bumper and it's made of solid metal. He likes to back into his driveway, which puts that winch right at the level of car doors when he's maneuvering around. This guy spends his weekends either hunting, fishing, or prepping for what he calls when the bombs drop. I tried explaining to him once that we live within the fallout range of a major city, so if anything happened we'd be in trouble either way, but he just shrugged it off. Everyone needs a hobby, I guess, and some people collect canned goods instead of baseball cards. The incident happened about 11 years ago now. I came outside one morning to head to a client meeting and immediately saw that my passenger side window was completely shattered. There was also a dent in the frame just above the door handle. The moment I saw the size and shape of that dent, I knew exactly what had caused it. Anyone could have played detective with this one just by looking at the evidence. The dent was almost perfectly shaped like that metal winch on my neighbor's Jeep. It was positioned at exactly the same height as where his winch was mounted. The scratches and paint transfer on the dent matched the metal of his winch perfectly. Plus, he lives directly across from me and backs into his driveway every single day, giving him plenty of opportunities to hit my car. I walked across the street and knocked on his door. When he answered, I was as polite as I could be under the circumstances. I asked him if he knew anything about my car getting hit and mentioned that the damage looked like it might have come from his winch. I wondered if he'd backed into it by accident or if maybe someone else had been driving his Jeep. He just stood there shaking his head and biting his lip like some cartoon character who got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He wouldn't say a word at first. I pressed him a bit more, explaining that accidents happen and asking if he'd loaned his Jeep to anyone or if there was any chance someone else had been driving it. I just needed to know so I could figure out how to handle the insurance. I noticed his winch was pretty scratched up too, like he'd been ramming it into things all over town. Again, he just shook his head silently. Then he finally spoke up and blamed it on teenagers. That was it. No explanation, no details, no offer to look at the damage or help figure out what happened. Just blamed it on teenagers and tried to end the conversation. I was fuming inside, but I kept my cool and went back to my house to call the police and my insurance company. The police officer who came out was straightforward with me. He told me it was obvious what had happened, and that the damage pattern matched the neighbor's winch perfectly. The positioning made sense given where I park and how my neighbor backs into his driveway. But without a witness or video footage, there wasn't much they could do legally. It would be my word against his. The insurance agent was equally sure about what had happened, but gave me some advice I wasn't expecting. He said that this was clearly the neighbor's fault, but since I was parked on the street, if I filed a claim, they might categorize this as negligence on my part for not parking in a safer location. That could increase my monthly rate significantly when they recalculated. He suggested I might want to consider paying out of pocket if the repair cost wasn't too high. A few hundred now could save me several hundred a year in increased premiums. It was a raw deal, but at least he was being honest with me about how the system worked. I ended up paying for the repairs myself, which cost me about $400. For the next 2 weeks, things were pretty tense between my neighbor and me. I'd wave when I saw him, but I kept our interactions brief and cold. Then something happened that would give me the perfect opportunity for revenge. He knocked on my door one evening with a request. He told me that he knew things had been a little weird between us lately, but he wanted to ask me a favor. His family and he were heading up north for a week to do some camping and hunting. He said I was the only person in the neighborhood he really trusted, so he was wondering if I could keep an eye on the house while they were gone. He handed me a case of beer as payment for house-sitting duties. He explained that the only thing was, if we got any severe weather while he was gone, he needed me to call him right away. There was something he'd need me to check on in the garage. When I asked what exactly I'd be checking for, he told me to just call him first, and he'd walk me through it. He mentioned his cell service might be spotty where they were going, but he wanted me to keep trying if he didn't answer right away. I agreed to watch his house not because I had any revenge planned at that point, but because free beer is free beer, and it wasn't much trouble to keep an eye on things. 2 nights after he left, we got hit with a nasty storm. There was heavy wind, hail the size of golf balls, and we had several rolling blackouts throughout the night. The next morning I remembered his request and tried calling him to ask what I needed to check in his garage. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried several more times over the next few hours with no luck. Figuring he was probably camping somewhere with no cell service, I decided to go check his garage myself. I knew his yard turned into a swamp after heavy rain, so I assumed he was worried about flooding. I used the spare key he'd given me and went into his garage. There was no flooding, but something else immediately caught my attention. 4 large chest freezers were lined up against one wall, taking up a huge chunk of space. I'd never noticed them before because the garage door was usually closed. Curiosity got the better of me, so I lifted the lid on one of the freezers. It was packed completely full of meat. Some was still in grocery store packaging, and some was wrapped in butcher paper, probably from his hunting trips. All 4 freezers were stuffed to capacity. Then I noticed something weird sitting on top of one of the freezers. It was a red plastic cup filled with what looked like frozen water, and there was a penny sitting right on top of the ice. I thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it at first. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to look it up online. What I found was an old life hack that people used when they went on vacation. You freeze a cup of water, then place a penny on top and put it in your freezer. If the power goes out while you're away, the ice melts and the penny sinks to the bottom. When you come back, if the penny is at the bottom of the cup, you know your freezer was off long enough for everything inside to potentially spoil. That's when it hit me. This was my chance for the perfect revenge. I went back to his garage to scope out the situation. His circuit breaker was hidden behind a tool shelf, not easily visible unless you knew where to look. Who puts a shelf in front of their electrical panel? This guy, apparently. I carefully removed the cup from the freezer and took it outside to sit in the sun. After a few hours, the ice had melted enough for the penny to sink to the bottom. I put the cup back in the freezer in exactly the same spot where I'd found it. Then came the final phase of my plan. I started bombarding his phone with frantic calls and text messages. I sent him texts saying his power went out during the storm and asking where his circuit breaker was. I told him I was at his house but couldn't find the breaker panel anywhere. I said it had been hours and his power was still off, and I was worried about whatever he wanted me to check on. I sent messages like this for 2 straight days before I finally got a call back. He apologized for missing my calls and explained that they were in a dead zone up there. He asked if I'd found the circuit breaker, and I told him I'd been looking everywhere for it. He explained that it was in the garage, behind the tool shelf, on the left wall, and that I might have to move some things to get to it. I told him to hold on while I checked, then put the phone down and went to the breaker panel. I flipped the main breaker off, waited about 30 seconds, then flipped it back on. This was just long enough to reset all the digital clocks in his house and make it look like there had been a real power outage. I got back on the phone and told him I'd found it, and the power was back on. He thanked me and said they'd be back in a couple days. When he returned from his trip, I was nervous but excited to see if my plan had worked. The next day there was a knock at my door. It was him, and he looked pretty upset. He told me he hated to bother me, but he had a problem. It looked like the power was out longer than they'd thought while he was gone. All the meat in his freezers had thawed out and he had to throw it away. He said he had probably 300 pounds of meat that was no good anymore. He paused and looked a little embarrassed. He explained that he knew I had dogs and he hated to waste all this meat. He asked if I'd want some of it for them. He was going around the neighborhood seeing if anyone with pets wanted some before he had to throw it all in the dumpster. I acted surprised and told him how terrible that was. I asked if he was sure it had all gone bad. He explained that he'd had this system set up to check if the freezer stayed cold while he was gone, and it definitely got too warm. He couldn't risk keeping any of it. I tried to look sympathetic while hiding my excitement. I told him that if he was sure it wasn't safe for him, my dogs would definitely appreciate it. When I asked how much we were talking about, he said probably about half a freezer's worth if I wanted it. He mentioned some really nice cuts too, including steaks, roasts, and even some venison from his hunting trips. I helped him load up several large bags of meat. Some of it I put in my own freezer, and he offered to store the rest in one of his freezers until I needed it, since he had so much empty space now. That night, I cooked up a couple of beautiful steaks for dinner. They were perfectly fine, of course, since the meat had never actually thawed. My dogs got some great meals too over the next few weeks. He continued to walk around the neighborhood for the next few days, knocking on doors and offering spoiled meat to anyone with pets. He ended up giving away hundreds of dollars worth of perfectly good meat because he thought his freezers had failed. It took me and my dogs about 4 months to get through all the meat he'd given us. I don't know if the value of the meat completely made up for what I'd paid to fix my car, but I didn't have to buy groceries for quite a while. So here I am, 17 years old, and let me tell you about the worst and somehow best day of my recovery. 3 weeks ago, I was skateboarding with my friends when I completely ate it, trying to land a trick I had no business attempting. The result was a nasty fracture in my left leg that left me stuck at home with nothing but streaming services and homework for company. My dad owns this little convenience store downtown that's been in our family for about 10 years. He started it after losing his corporate job, and it became his pride and joy. I spent countless afternoons there doing homework behind the counter or helping stock shelves. The employees were like extended family, and I knew every regular customer by name. Dad always said the store was as much mine as it was his, which is why I had permission to grab snacks whenever I wanted. After being cooped up for what felt like forever, I finally convinced my parents to let me venture out on my crutches. My first stop was obviously going to be the store. I missed the familiar sounds, the smell of fresh coffee brewing, and just being around people who weren't my immediate family. When I hobbled through the front door, the bell chimed, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. The afternoon shift employees were there, and they all lit up when they saw me. Sarah got excited and joked about how I'd finally escaped house arrest. I laughed and told her I was going crazy being stuck inside. Mike asked how my leg was feeling and if I was getting around okay on the crutches. I told him it wasn't too bad, and definitely beat being stuck on the couch all day. I made my way slowly down the snack aisle, my crutches clicking against the linoleum floor. My stomach was growling something fierce, since I'd skipped lunch in my excitement to get out. I grabbed my favorite bag of barbecue chips and, without really thinking about it, tore it open and started eating. This was totally normal for me. Dad had always told me to treat the place like home, and the staff knew I was family. I was debating between a chocolate bar and some gummy bears when this woman walked up to me. She had this perfect soccer mom haircut and was dragging a kid who looked about 8 years old behind her. The moment I saw her face, I knew I was in trouble. Karen demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I was confused and asked her what she meant. She said she saw me steal those chips and start eating them, calling it theft. I tried to explain that my dad owned the store, so I was allowed to take snacks. But she wasn't having it. Karen accused me of making up stories to cover my theft and said she was calling the manager. I insisted I wasn't lying and asked her to talk to any of the employees who would confirm my story. She refused to listen and said she didn't want to hear another word from me. She called me a little thief and demanded I pay for the chips and apologize for trying to scam her. I looked around desperately for Sarah or Mike, but they were both helping other customers and hadn't noticed what was happening. My heart started racing when this woman got more aggressive. I tried to explain that I understood how it looked, but asked if she could give me a second to call my dad or get one of the workers to confirm my story. Karen refused and said she'd had enough of entitled teenagers like me, thinking we could get away with anything. She said I was going to learn a lesson that day. That's when her kid decided to join in on the fun. Without any warning, he reached out and grabbed one of my crutches right out from under me. I felt myself losing balance immediately. I yelled at him, asking what he was doing, but before I could steady myself, Karen actually grabbed my other crutch and gave me a hard shove. I went down face first, my bad leg screaming in pain when I hit the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I just lay there in shock. Karen stood over me saying, maybe now I'd think twice before stealing. I tried to push myself up, but my leg was throbbing and I couldn't put any weight on it. Karen wasn't done though. She actually sat down on my back, pinning me to the ground. Karen told me I wasn't going anywhere until the police got there to arrest me for theft. I begged her to stop because she was hurting me, and my leg was broken. She said I should have thought about that before I decided to steal. I was starting to panic. The pain in my leg was getting worse, and this crazy woman was literally sitting on me in the middle of the store. I tried calling out for help, but she just pressed down harder. That's when I heard the heavy footsteps running toward us. I looked up and saw my dad charging down the aisle, and let me tell you, he was not happy. My dad is 6'8" and built like a truck from all his years doing construction before he opened the store. His arms are covered in tattoos, and when he's angry, he's honestly pretty intimidating. Dad yelled at Karen to get off his daughter right now. Karen looked up, and I saw her face go pale. Dad grabbed her by the collar and literally lifted her off me like she weighed nothing. He repeated his demand and tossed Karen aside. She went crashing into a display of canned goods. Cans went flying everywhere, and she disappeared under an avalanche of soup and vegetables. Her kids started crying hysterically. Dad immediately knelt down next to me, his whole demeanor changing from rage to concern. He asked if I was okay and whether she had hurt my leg. I told him I thought I was okay, but it really hurt. He told me not to try to move and said he was calling an ambulance. Karen finally managed to crawl out from under the pile of cans, looking disheveled and furious. She screamed that Dad couldn't assault her and threatened to call the police. She insisted that I had been stealing. Dad told her that this was his store and I was his daughter. He explained that I had permission to eat anything I wanted there. Karen said that was impossible and accused him of lying to protect me. Dad called for Sarah and Mike to come over. Both employees came running, and their faces went from confusion to anger when they saw me on the floor. Sarah asked what happened and if I was hurt. Dad explained that this woman had assaulted me and accused me of theft. Mike couldn't believe it and said everyone knew I was Dad's daughter. He pointed out that I'd been coming to the store since I was little. Karen accused them all of being in on some conspiracy. At this point, other customers had gathered around, and several of them started speaking up. One customer said they saw the whole thing and that Karen had attacked a girl on crutches. Another customer described how she knocked me down and sat on me, calling it awful. Dad had already called 911, and within minutes, we could hear sirens outside. The paramedics came in first and started checking me over while the police talked to Karen. The officer told Karen that multiple witnesses said she had assaulted me. Karen insisted I was stealing and claimed she was making a citizen's arrest. The officer explained that even if that were true, which it clearly wasn't since this was my father's store, she couldn't physically assault someone and hold them down. The officer asked my dad if he wanted to press charges. Dad said absolutely, explaining that she had attacked his daughter who was recovering from a broken leg. Karen protested that it was ridiculous and insisted they couldn't arrest her for stopping a thief. The officer told Karen she was under arrest for assault and read her rights. Karen kept screaming about how unfair it all was while they put the handcuffs on her. Her kid was still crying and I actually felt a little bad for him. A relative showed up to take him while his mom got arrested. The paramedics told me I was okay, just shaken up and sore. My leg wasn't any worse than before, thankfully. Karen was being led to the police car when she looked back at me with pure hatred. Karen yelled that this wasn't over and threatened to sue us for everything we were worth. Dad told her good luck with that and mentioned we had security cameras that recorded the whole thing. And that was true. Dad showed the footage to the police and it clearly showed Karen attacking me unprovoked. It turned out she had a history of causing problems at local businesses, always claiming other people were stealing or cheating somehow. A few weeks later, we found out Karen was charged with assault and had to pay a fine. She also got banned from our store permanently. I live next to this couple in their 50s. The husband has dementia, which honestly breaks my heart. Watching someone's mind slip away like that is one of the hardest things to witness. But his wife is a whole different story. When the incidents first started, I thought it was innocent enough. The poor guy would just stand there looking confused, maybe pick up a stick or examine my garden. I felt bad for him. Dementia is cruel. I'd gently guide him back to his own yard and knock on his wife's door to let her know. She'd always seem annoyed, like I was bothering her instead of helping. The incident started getting worse. I find him trying to open my back door, or sitting in my patio furniture like he lived there. One morning I caught him turning on my garden hose and flooding my flower bed. Each time I'd call his wife, and each time she'd act like it was no big deal. My breaking point came last Tuesday. I was working on a logo design when I heard this scraping noise outside. I looked up from my computer and nearly had a heart attack. There was my neighbor, halfway up the side of my storage shed, trying to climb onto the roof. The shed is about 8 feet tall and definitely not built for human climbing. I could see him struggling, his feet slipping on the wooden slats I'd nailed up as decoration. My heart was pounding when I watched this man with dementia attempt what looked like a suicide mission. I dropped everything and ran outside, pulling out my phone to call his wife. I told her that her husband was climbing my shed right now and she needed to come over immediately. She asked what I meant by climbing the shed, sounding confused. I explained that he was literally scaling the wall like it was Mount Everest and was going to fall and hurt himself. She asked if I couldn't just tell him to come down. This woman expected me to handle her husband's dangerous behavior while she stayed comfortable in her house. I told her he wasn't listening to me and asked her to please just come over. By the time she showed up, her husband had made it to the roof. He was standing up there looking around like he'd conquered something magnificent. I was terrified he'd fall and break his neck. I thanked God she was there and asked if she could please get him down safely. Instead of rushing to help or showing any concern, she just stood there with her arms crossed, watching like this was some kind of entertainment. She said he'd come down when he was ready. I asked if she was serious because he could fall and seriously hurt himself. She told me he was fine and to stop being so dramatic. I was stunned. This woman was watching her husband with dementia stand on my shed roof like it was perfectly normal behavior. Then, when the universe wanted to prove my point, he decided to jump. I watched in horror when this man leaped off my shed like he was diving into a swimming pool. He hit the ground hard, landing awkwardly on his left leg. The sound he made when he hit the dirt will haunt me forever. I asked if he was okay, rushing toward him. The husband was clearly in pain, holding his leg and groaning. I started moving toward him to help, but his wife beat me to it. Finally, I thought, she's gonna show some appropriate concern. Instead, she pulled out her phone and I assumed she was calling an ambulance. I was wrong again. She called the police and told them she needed officers at my address because her husband had been injured due to my negligence. My jaw dropped. She was calling the cops on me because her husband hurt himself jumping off my shed. I asked what she was doing and she said I should have stopped him from climbing up there in the first place. I asked how that was my responsibility since he was her husband. She replied that he was on my property, which made it my problem. Her husband had trespassed onto my property, climbed my shed without permission, and somehow his injury was my fault because I didn't physically restrain a grown man with dementia. When the police arrived, I was actually relieved. Finally, some rational people who could see how insane this situation was. The first officer asked me to tell them what happened. I explained that I saw her husband climbing my shed, called her immediately to come help, get him down safely, and he jumped off before she could do anything about it. Karen interrupted, claiming I was lying and that I should have prevented her husband from getting hurt. She insisted that since it was my property, it was my responsibility. The second officer asked her if her husband was prone to wandering. She said that wasn't the point and that the real issue was that I had allowed her husband to get injured. I told the officers I had security cameras that recorded the whole thing and asked if they'd like to see the footage. I led them to my back door, where I pulled up the camera app on my phone. The footage clearly showed her husband entering my yard spending several minutes examining my shed, then starting his climb. It showed me running outside and immediately calling someone on my phone. Most importantly, it showed the timestamp, proving she took over 10 minutes to arrive after my call. The first officer confirmed that I had called his wife immediately when I saw him climbing. I said yes, and pointed out how long it took her to get there. I explained that I was trying to talk him down the whole time, but he wouldn't listen. The second officer told Karen that her husband appeared to have wandered onto my property without permission and that I wasn't legally obligated to supervise her husband. She protested that he got hurt on my property. The first officer pointed out that this happened after trespassing and engaging in dangerous behavior despite my attempts to help. The officers were clearly trying to be diplomatic, but I could see they thought the whole situation was ridiculous. After reviewing the footage and taking statements, they determined no crime had been committed. But Karen wasn't done. When the officers were preparing to leave, she decided to make a scene for the entire neighborhood. She shouted that this was unacceptable and that everyone needed to know what kind of person lived here. She started yelling about how I was a terrible neighbor who didn't care about the safety of others. She told anyone who would listen that I had allowed her husband to get hurt and refused to take responsibility. She screamed that I just stood there and watched her husband fall, asking what kind of person does that. A few neighbors had come out to see what the commotion was about. I was mortified, but I wasn't about to let her lies go unchallenged. I asked the officers if they could please explain to everyone what actually happened. The second officer told everyone that the security footage showed I immediately called for help when I saw the situation developing. He explained that I wasn't responsible for supervising other people's family members on my own property. Karen yelled that this wasn't over and that she was calling a lawyer. The first officer said that was her right, but mentioned that trespassing was actually illegal, while refusing to physically restrain someone else's spouse was not. After the police left and Karen finally went home with her injured husband, I sat in my backyard feeling completely drained. Several neighbors came over to check on me and expressed their disbelief at what they'd witnessed. My neighbor from across the street shook her head and said the whole thing was crazy. The couple next door mentioned they'd also had issues with the husband wandering into their yard. It seemed like Karen had been letting this go on for months without taking proper precautions. That evening, I researched dementia care and adult protective services. I realized this wasn't just about my property anymore. This man was clearly not receiving adequate supervision, and his wife seemed either unable or unwilling to provide it. The next day, I installed additional security cameras and called Adult Protective Services to report the situation. I explained that a man with dementia was regularly wandering unsupervised and had recently injured himself during a dangerous incident. 2 days later, a social worker came to assess the situation. Through my window, I watched when she spent over an hour at their house. A few hours after she left, I saw a van from a local home care service pull up to their driveway. Since then, I've noticed a caregiver arriving each morning and staying most of the day. The husband still goes outside, but now he's always supervised. He waves at me sometimes when I'm in my garden, and I wave back. The man isn't the problem. He's sick and can't help his behavior. Karen, on the other hand, hasn't spoken to me since the incident. She looks at me with anger whenever she sees me, but at least she's not letting her husband wander unsupervised anymore. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.